The Gospels in the New Testament, the first four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the books that tell us about the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when you read the Gospels, you see that all over the place that Jesus was amazing other people. They were amazed at what he did. Over 30 times the people were amazed by Jesus. Well, there's 2 times where Jesus was amazed. 2 times where Jesus' jaw dropped and he went, whoa. And the interesting thing is that it was connected to the same issue. One time in a negative sense, the other time in a positive sense. The first time, it's in a negative sense. It's in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus returns back to his hometown, Nazareth, and he preaches in the synagogue that Sabbath. And during the sermon, he unmistakably makes a claim to be the Messiah, the hero that God had promised to send to their people. Now, by this point, Jesus had already performed a lot of miracles. He taught with authority. There were some things he'd done to back that claim up, but did the people in his hometown believe him? No, not. Isn't that Joseph's son? Isn't that Mary's son? Isn't that the carpenter? In fact, they got offended, and they grouped up together, and they tried to take hold of Jesus and throw him off a cliff. All right? I thought you guys were a tough crowd. But it's so interesting what it says. Jesus in Mark 6:6 says he was amazed at their lack of what? Their lack of faith. That's interesting. Well, the second time Jesus was amazed, it was in a good way. Him and the disciples had been out ministering in the countryside around the Sea of Galilee. They were going to the town of Capernaum when a messenger from a master reached them and asked Jesus, please come and see, and I want you to heal my master's servant. The interesting thing was that master was a Roman centurion. Remember, the Romans had conquered the Jews. I mean, this was the enemy who was occupying them. So the Jews hated the Romans, and they thought they were spiritually ignorant for the most part. So everyone was pretty shocked then when Jesus decided, okay, I'm going to go see this Roman centurion and heal his servant. Well, before he even gets there, the Roman centurion dispatches another messenger who goes to Jesus. And it's interesting. Let's pick it up in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verse 6. He, speaking of Jesus, was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That's incredibly humbling for a Roman centurion to say. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. So this Roman centurion had so much faith in Jesus. He knew Jesus could heal long distance. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. And that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. So maybe these Roman centurions weren't so spiritually ignorant after all. I mean, he gets some things intuitively that the Jews who should have known better, they couldn't get it. Now look at Jesus' response. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. There's that word again. And turning to the crowd, follow him, and he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. So there it is again. What amazes Jesus? It's faith. He's amazed at the lack of faith, and he's amazed at the presence of faith. It just highlights this truth that faith is so critical. It reinforces this truth that we've been just laser focused on this summer that comes out of Hebrews 11:6. It tells us, and without faith, it's impossible to please God. Remember, it all boils down to faith. If you want to make sure that you are at peace with God, with your Maker, Creator, the one that you're going to have to give an account to for your life, what he is looking for is not perfection, not performance in the sense of where we're trying to earn it or deserve it or repaying it. What he is looking for is faith. But it's not enough to know that faith is what God is looking for. We also need to understand what kind of faith God is looking for. Because we don't just get to come up with our own definition and say, hey, no, I got faith. God, you have to be happy. We need to know what kind of faith he's looking for. Because this is so critical, we have been spending the whole summer on this, on discovering what real faith is and what real faith does. And we've been doing this by bouncing back and forth between 2 books, Hebrews and Genesis. Hebrews 11 in particular, because in Hebrews 11 we get the Hall of Fame of faith. That's where the author lists out name after name after name of people who were made right with God, not because of their works, but because of their faith. That's why they were seen as commendable. And then Genesis, because the stories of those who are listed in the Hall of Fame of Faith, their stories are found in Genesis. At least the first 23 verses of Hebrews 11, it points back to Genesis. And I just think it's cool to look at their lives because really, these are the first people in recorded history who are found commendable by God because of their faith. These are the first ones to show us the kind of faith that God is looking for. So when we look at their lives, we see vintage faith. And while this journey, I think, has been challenging for us, I think it's also been helpful because it's shown us that real faith, vintage faith, it is incredibly tangible and it's practical and it's something you can live out in your everyday life and it's something that drives your everyday decisions. Now, if you've missed any of these, because this is so critical, you owe it to yourself to go get caught up. And you can do that. We have all of these messages on our website. It's free, mitchellwesleyan.com. You can just click on the watch button, and that sends you to our sermons page. Today, we are turning down the home stretch of this series. And we are going to begin to look at the life of the last person in the Hall of Fame of Faith whose story is given in the book of Genesis. His name is Joseph. He shows up as a blip on the screen in Genesis 30, and then you really get into his story in Genesis 37. So go ahead and start turning there. Genesis 37, just a few pages into your Bibles there. And while you turn there, I'm going to give you some background. There is so much about real vintage faith we can learn about from Joseph's life. Well, remember, though, that Joseph was Jacob's father. We just spent the last 3 weeks looking at Jacob's life. If you remember, Jacob had two wives, Rachel and Leah. And if that wasn't a situation fraught with enough peril the way it was, these two wives were actually sisters as well. And it all started out like this. Jacob went to work for his uncle Laban, and he did such a good job. Laban's like, well, what can I pay you to keep you around? And Jacob said, I will work for you 7 years if you give me the hand of your daughter Rachel in marriage. Rachel was the younger, and Jacob was smitten with her. He was in love with her. They agreed. Jacob worked 7 years for Laban. But on the night of the wedding, Laban slipped Leah, the older sister, into the tent instead of Rachel. And either it was too dark or Jacob was too inebriated, but he made love to Leah. When he woke up the next morning and realized, I am now married to Leah, he was furious. So he went to Laban, how could you do this to me? And Laban said, no, it wouldn't have been right for me to give my younger daughter away before my older daughter. So how about this? How about I agree to give you Rachel after this bridal week. You can have her as your wife too, and you work for me another 7 years. We'll call it even. Well, that's not a very good way to start a family, is it? Jacob, he'd loved Rachel from the first. She was the one who'd captured his heart. So in a number of different ways, moving forward, he made it known that Rachel was his favorite, which just drives me nuts because he should have known better. Jacob grew up in a household where mom and dad played favorites, and it just wreaked havoc in their lives. What is he doing? But he had these two wives. And just as a side note here, just because you find something in the Bible doesn't mean that the Bible or God endorses it. And that's especially the case with this, with a guy having multiple wives. We see it a lot of places in the Bible where some of the big-time heroes of the faith had multiple wives, like Abraham, like Jacob, like David, like Solomon. He had 300 wives. My goodness. But the Bible has also made it very clear that God's plan for marriage is for one man and one woman to come together in this covenant relationship and be faithful to each other until death parts them. So his design for marriage is clear. And so it doesn't mean God has given these guys a thumbs up when they take on multiple wives. And as I read their stories, it's like, it never goes well. It never goes well when they have multiple wives. The Bible's just reporting the facts, right? Never opens the doorway to blessing. It opens the gateway to chaos, actually. And we see that especially in Jacob's life. So Rachel and Leah are his wives. Rachel is his favorite. But for a number of years, Rachel isn't able to bear a son for Jacob, which was huge. Actually, she wasn't able to bear any children, but a son was particularly huge because he would have been the heir. Meanwhile, Leah was able to bear children for Jacob. She was having children left and right. After a while, Rachel became so desperate, she said, I'm going to have Jacob bear a child with my maidservant, because legally that could be reckoned as her child. So she had Jacob sleep with her maidservant, and the maidservant gave Jacob some kids. Well, then Leah was no longer able to bear children for a while, so she got her maidservant involved. And there was this crazy messed up competition going on in the family. But eventually, Rachel bore Jacob a child, a boy, Joseph. So Joseph is the firstborn of the favorite wife. Rachel gave Jacob another son later on, Benjamin, but she died after giving birth to him. And so Joseph he was born into a mess. That takes us to Genesis 37. Let's start at verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. But actually they weren't like his primary wives, they were the secondary wives, these maidservants of Rachel and Leah. And so Joseph is out working with these boys who are his older half-brothers. And he brought their father a bad report about them, right? So he's playing the tattletale here. And I doubt that fostered brotherly love. Verse 3, now Israel, or another name for Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and as I said before, was the son of Rachel, his favorite wife. And he made an ornate robe for him. All right, the fact that it is an ornate robe, that is significant beyond the fact that you have a father giving a very expensive, beautiful gift to one of the kids and not the others. It even goes beyond that. That's bad enough. But remember, Jacob's family, even though they were wealthy, they were still a working family. They still all had to tend the sheep. And they probably all had robes, but not like Joseph's. They probably all had the beige, the bland, sleeveless robes that workmen wear. Workmen don't wear ornate robes. Rulers wear ornate robes. In fact, later in the Old Testament, the same word used here for ornate in the Hebrew is used later to describe royal robes. So, in a sense, this is Jacob's way of letting the rest of the family know that Joseph has just graduated to management ahead of everyone else. It's also probably an indication that Jacob planned to treat Joseph as the firstborn when it came to the inheritance and as far as who was going to lead the family. So no wonder we see this in verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated them, and they could not speak a kind word to them. It just boggles my mind. How did Jacob not see the damage that he was doing in this? But then Joseph decided to add some fuel to the fire himself. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to mine. Isn't that cool, guys? They didn't like that so much. Now, I think at this point, Joseph is so secure in his favored status, he's not even aware he's flaunting it. I'm guessing he's clueless. Also remember, he's 17. And so that's kind of when senioritis really kicks in. And most 17-year-olds just naturally think that the world revolves around them. I don't think he's aware of how galling this dream had to be for his brothers. Verse 8, his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he'd said. You know, Joseph is going to show later on that he's a pretty smart guy. You would think that there had to be some warning like, danger, danger. But he did not pick those signals up because verse 9, then he had another dream and he told it to his brothers because they loved the last dream so much. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. I mean, wow, guys, isn't that great? Guys? I'm going to go tell Dad. He'll love it. So he went and he told his dad. When he told his father, verse 10, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him, said, what is this dream you had? Even Jacob isn't amused by this. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him. Never good to let jealousy simmer in your life. That isn't just a decision. That takes you down a path. That leads somewhere. But his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their flocks near Shechem. So if there was like a soundtrack to Genesis, anytime the name Shechem came up, the music would change. I don't know what it would change to, but Shechem, all throughout Genesis, it's a town of intrigue. Crazy things happen around Shechem. It's like the Las Vegas of the Old Testament is what it is. So even just hearing that they're around Shechem, you know something's going to happen. Now his brothers have gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel, or Jacob, said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to them, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks. And, bring word back to me. Because your brothers just loved it when you brought a report on them last time. Again, how could Jacob not see trouble is coming? All right, so for a number of years, I worked for East River Electric, and one of my roles was project inspection. Whenever we hired a contractor to grade a site for us or to construct foundations, I got to be the inspector for that. And no matter how good my relationship was with the foreman or the superintendent, they were never excited when I pulled up onto the site. They were never, yay, he's here. By the way, how many of you would like Joseph as a brother right now? I don't think any of you would want Joseph as your brother. So he's off to go find his brothers and check on how they're doing. Skip down to verse 18. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. That's where jealousy can lead if you allow it to just keep simmering and simmering. Doesn't stay in the pot, boils over. And it grieves me because this is now for sure at least the second generation in a family where one brother is ready to kill the other. I could say it was even the third generation in a row now if you're reading between the lines with Ishmael and Isaac a few generations back. It just again reminds me that we chart a course for the generations that are going to follow us. The decisions we make send ripples into their lives. What course are you charting for those who are coming after you? Verse 19, here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Those just stuck in their craw. When Reuben, and he's the oldest brother, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him and take him back to his father. Maybe he was wanting to get back in good graces with his dad or get that firstborn status back. So when Joseph came to his brothers, there's no record of any conversation. It just goes right to this. They stripped him of his robe, that ornate robe that he was wearing. I mean, they couldn't get it off him fast enough. And they took him and they threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on the way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. So it's okay to sell him into slavery. Blows me away how we will justify what's in our minds a lesser sin by saying, well, at least I'm not doing this, a bigger sin. I mean, we've all done that. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Now, this is fascinating to me. If you dig into the book of Genesis, you'll see the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, they were family. They were related to the Ishmaelites through Abraham. They were related to the Midianites through Abraham. So they were kin. What are they doing accepting a relative as a slave and sending him down to Egypt? Business is business, I guess. And they sold him for 20 shekels of silver. Now, that was a lot of money, but you split it 11 ways, amongst the 11 brothers. This was not about the money. Verse 29, when Reuben returned to the cistern, evidently he'd left the scene for a while, saw that Joseph was not there. He tore his clothes, went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Notice they didn't say our brother's robe. No, your son's robe. He recognized it and he said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Well, then the focus shifts to Judah for a chapter, a crazy chapter. But then it comes back to Joseph in verse 39, or chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So Potiphar, as captain of the guard, he would have been way, way high up in the court of the Pharaoh. He would have been responsible for operating the prisons. He would have been responsible for making sure that sentences were carried out, especially the death sentences. And so Joseph, in just a very, very short time, he went from being favorite son, wearing the ornate robe. I mean, he's climbing the ladder. He's on the fast track. Suddenly being a slave and a stranger in a strange land, a pagan land where they don't even worship God. Yeah, that's a curveball. So if you were in Joseph's shoes at this point, would you still be clinging onto those God-given dreams? Or would you be grinding your teeth? What would your heart towards God be at that point? It's never easy when life gives us a curveball, and it seems like everything, even God-given dreams, maybe especially God-given dreams, are falling apart. But when we're faced with those circumstances, we are faced with a choice. Will those circumstances cause us to run to God and cling to Him, or will it push us away where we run from Him? And I've seen it go both ways. I've seen people respond either way. It seems like nothing exposes where our faith truly lies, like adversity. And for Joseph, evidently, that caused him to press into God and trust Him. Because the Bible mentions for the first time now God's activity or God's presence in Joseph's life. Verse 2, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field." So Joseph is just racking up Employee of the Month after Employee of the Month award. I wouldn't want Joseph to be my brother, but I'd sure like to hire him. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. And with Joseph in charge, he didn't concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Wow. What would it be like to be at this point where the hardest decision you have to make at night is, what sounds good? What do I want to eat? Joseph, can you give me a couple ideas at least? Must be tough. Just when you think things are going to turn out okay for Joseph, look at this. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one's greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against..." Now, here's where I would expect him to say, "my master." Because up to this point, he's going on and on about his master and all that his master has trusted him with. But he doesn't say that. He says, "Now, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Now, it's not because Joseph didn't think it would be a sin against Potiphar. But Joseph could see even beyond that. He could see that while it would be a sin against Potiphar, ultimately, and more to the point, it would be a sin against God. You need to understand this, folks. When all is said and done, all sin is against God. All sin offends him. All sin hurts him, grieves him, wounds him. And even though God had allowed Joseph to be betrayed by his brothers, even though God had allowed for him to be sold into slavery, Joseph had committed to living a life that would honor God. He was going to remain pure. He wasn't going to allow broken dreams to break his faith. That amazes me. Verse 10, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Why? Because at the end of the day, he remembered he answered to God. So he wasn't going to compromise. He wasn't going to give in to temptation. In fact, he did everything he could to avoid temptation. Sometimes you can't win for losing, though. And sometimes temptation comes looking for you. Verse 11, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She, speaking of Potiphar's wife, and she probably engineered this whole scenario. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. You know, so often in Scripture, we are told, stand strong, be brave. Not when it comes to sexual temptation. We aren't told to be strong. We are told to flee from sexual immorality. 1 Corinthians 6:18 says. In other words, don't hang in there. Don't see how long you can hold out. Don't see how strong you can be. No, go. Run. Don't collect $200. Just get out of there. I think that says something about the powerful nature of sexual temptation. I'm going to geek out here just a little bit. I really like the books, The Lord of the Rings. And I like the movies too, but I like the books even better. And in The Two Towers, the second book, we run into this hero named Faramir. And Faramir has an opportunity to take the ring. The whole book's about this ring that promises unlimited power. And no one is able to withstand the temptation of this ring. Faramir's brother, Boromir, had tried to take it by force. Faramir said no to it. And the statement he made always stuck with me. He says, I mean, this is a manly man here, right? This is a tough dude. But he said, I'm man enough to know the battles from which a man should flee. And that goes right into this. Flee from sexual immorality. And so Joseph, he didn't stick around. He left his cloak behind even. Now maybe by this point he wasn't all that attached to cloaks. He has some history with cloaks here. But this is definitely a sexual temptation issue. All right, if his primary concern had been how can I not get in trouble with Potiphar, he would have made sure to have that cloak with him because that was evidence. And Joseph was a smart guy. But evidently, priority number one was getting out of this sexually tempting situation. For anything else, he was committed to remaining on the path of purity and not going down this path of indulgence or compromise. And there we see Joseph's faith breaking through. Vintage faith walks the path of sexual purity. It takes faith to say no to instant gratification, especially in this area of instant sexual gratification. But it shows faith. It shows faith because it is a powerful way of saying, God, I know I could get my kicks right here in the moment, but I believe your ways are good. And I believe that if I cling to you and if I follow you, you will reward me in the right way at the right time. So even I could have this now, I'm saying no to it. I'm trusting you. Joseph did that in circumstances that were incredibly difficult. Think of all that he'd experienced that had led him to this point. Circumstances he probably couldn't even explain. I was my father's favorite. I was trustworthy. I was going to inherit the most. I was going to be the leader of the family. God gave me these dreams. Why did he let my brothers betray me? Why has he allowed me to wind up a slave in this mess of a country? It would have been so easy to become disillusioned. It would have been so easy to justify grabbing whatever he could while he could get it. Because honestly, humanly speaking, what are his prospects for joy and fulfillment, even sexual fulfillment moving forward? Nothing. He has no prospects of that. Temptation is tempting enough in the best of circumstances. Even when everything is going great and the tank is full and I'm satisfied with life, temptation can be tempting. But when you face temptation going through the valley of unfulfilled promises, of unmet needs, temptation is so strong in those moments. And we can be so susceptible. But Joseph, in faith, he stays to the path of sexual purity. To jump in and to indulge in that moment would be an incredible lack of faith. It would be a very clear way of saying, God, I really don't trust you. I don't trust that your plans for me are good. God, I don't trust that your plan for sex being between a husband and wife and that's it. I don't trust that that's God. We've come up with lots of different ways. Woohoo! I'm going to go with those. So I'm going to grab what I can while I can. And we have our excuses as well. God, I have needs. There's no harm in looking. Come on, God. We're going to get married. Probably. It's consensual, God. We agree. No one's getting hurt here. No. You are getting hurt. And everyone else involved is getting hurt. There may be a long fuse on those consequences. But you're getting hurt. And God's getting hurt. And that's what Joseph had kept in view. If I did this, ultimately, this would hurt God. And vintage faith, real faith, the kind of faith that God is looking for, it walks the path of sexual purity, if for any reason, for God's sake. And that's enough. But in reality, you're rescuing yourself as well when you stay to that path, because when you get off track and you take that path of sexual impurity, sexual immorality, you short-circuit your capacity for real intimacy. Because people stop becoming people in your life, and they start becoming objects to you. They start becoming tools to bring you sexual pleasure. They start becoming a means to an end. You dehumanize them. And you lose the ability to genuinely connect with someone else. When you indulge in sexual immorality, you also will eventually, if not immediately, cause all sorts of relational carnage in your life and in the life of the others involved. And you will also lose your capacity to work for and stand for what's right. When you take this path, it hamstrings you morally. The enemy of our soul, he is just this master of the bait and switch, and he will push us into sexual immorality, saying, it's no big deal, God will forgive you. But the moment that we cave, the moment we give in, the switch flips, and then he weighs us down with shame. How could you? You're dirty. God knows he'll never work through you. And it saps us of moral courage. It saps us of moral strength. We'll run into all sorts of situations where we know what the right thing is to do, but I can't because I know what I've done. Vintage faith walks the path of sexual purity. And I've been in the ministry long enough now to know that this isn't just a teenager issue. This isn't just a guy issue. Are you on the path of sexual purity? Are there sources of sexual temptation in your life that you're just giving room for and it's okay that they're there? You're playing with fire and it is just a matter of time before you get burnt. I can't think of a conversation where I've had with a person and we've talked about what our greatest regrets in life are. And if a person has compromised or tripped up in this area, almost every time that comes up as one of their top regrets in life. Oh, if only I wouldn't have. And so if you're here today and God is tapping you on the shoulder and you're beginning to feel that weight of conviction, first I just want you to know there is a difference between conviction and condemnation. It's not a mistake that you're here today, but God didn't bring you here just to beat you up. He is convicting you to prod you to change. You're being here today. He is opening up this way of escape for you. He will not force you to go through it, but He is opening for you a way of escape that leads to freedom, that leads to purity, that leads to life without regrets. And so if you're ready to follow His lead in this, and like, oh, it's time. I can't let this wreak havoc in my life anymore. And if you're ready to follow Him on this, there's a couple just critical steps you need to take. First one is that you would ruthlessly eliminate the sources of temptation in your life. Cut cable if that's what's tripping you up. Get the accountability software on the internet. End that relationship where you're just kind of playing around the boundaries. End it, and don't spend a lot of time explaining why. Just go, run, flee. And it's not about seeing how strong you can be or how long you can last. Get out of there. Cut those sources of temptation out. Jesus is very to the point in Matthew chapter 5. He says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. All right, do you think this applies to the area of sexual temptation? Now, I think it's pretty clear that Jesus is using hyperbole here. He's using an exaggerated statement to get our attention. I'm not saying you should take it literally, but I love what Mark Batterson says. Just because you shouldn't take it literally doesn't mean you should take it seriously. You should take it very seriously. Ruthlessly cut out those sources of temptation you've been allowing room for in your life. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. There's another critical step. You also need to open up to a trusted friend. As long as you keep this a secret, it is going to continue to have power over your life. It's what shame does. I don't know anyone who has gotten back on track in this area in isolation or because of their own effort. You got to take that step. And honestly, you'll probably be helping the person you open up to in this area. I think that's why James, who is Jesus' brother, he calls us to this in James 5:16. He says, therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Don't just confess to God. You know, I just want to keep this between me and God on this. No. Confess to each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. That's another part of this. Another part is just seek really, really hard after God. Get focused in on Him and pursue Him wholeheartedly. Psalm 119, verses 9 and 10. How can a young person stay on the path of purity? This applies to more than just young people. By living according to your word. I seek you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commands. So following God and honoring Him in our lives, there's so much more to it than just avoiding the bad things and not sinning. It's also about doing the good things and pursuing Him. Especially in our culture, I don't think anyone can just, of their own strength, keep to that path of purity. So look to God for strength. Seek Him daily on this. Start your day even praying about this and set your mind on the beauty of His truth. And then get busy living out His will for your life. The more you're bored, the more room you leave for this to operate in your life, sexual temptation. But the last thing you will be is bored if you are keeping in step with the Spirit and you're following those promptings He gives you every day. Yeah, the last thing you will be is bored. And this isn't just about defeating lust in our life. This is about growing in genuine love. And it'll be a journey. But these are critical steps. Again, ruthlessly eliminating the sources of temptation. Open up to a trusted friend and then seek really, really hard after God. Don't wait to move on this. Don't wait for things to spin out of control and you don't have any choice left. Don't wait for things to become irreversibly embarrassing or irreversibly damaged. If this is a live issue in your life, God has brought you here for a reason, and He is in pursuit of you. He is grieved by the sin that you've been walking with in your life. But more than that, He is opening that door to freedom, and it's His invitation to take those steps. Will it be easy? Absolutely not. I know that. I know that from my own life. I know that. But if it was easy, it wouldn't require faith. Does this mean all of a sudden then life is going to get easy and it's going to be smooth sailing? Probably not. It might get more challenging. Joseph found that out. It's not like he passed this test and God opened the floodgates. No, he found out there was something worse than being a servant. You could be a prisoner. We're going to find that out next week. But this was still critical to his story. This is what kept the door open for those God-given dreams to eventually come true. And it is always worth taking the path of purity. There is no regret on that path. What's that worth? So take the steps. Don't wait. Now, I know this is a huge and heavy topic. And if you're not sure who you can talk to, I hope you know that the pastoral team that we're here, you can come talk to us and we're here for you. But run with these steps. And in the meantime, let me pray for us. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you that you have given us your word, and I thank you that in your word we see the real struggles and real temptations of real people. Things that impact our lives and speak to our lives even today. And God, I'm guessing there's some people here today who really needed to hear this. Maybe even right now their heart is just pounding with that sense of conviction. And they know that you're speaking to them. In the midst of that conviction, though, God, I would also pray for that assurance that they're not alone, that this is not game over, and that you are ready to help them, Lord. You are longing for them to discover the freedom and the joy and the power of purity. So God, help them take the steps they need to take this week. Even today, help them get started. Do something tangible before the sun goes down. And as they do, I pray that they would experience, Lord, just very quickly how good and life-giving your ways are. It's in the name of Jesus that I pray. Amen. So as I've been saying throughout this whole series, Vintage Faith isn't just here, it isn't just here, it's incredibly practical, maybe even painfully practical. I think that could be said for today's subject. So before you go, let me leave you with this. This is from Philippians 4:8. I think this will help. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. You're going to have a choice about what you're going to think about, what you're going to look at this week. Use that as your filter. Use that as your grid. God bless you as you run with these truths this week. Have a great rest of your Sunday.